So yesterday we have stopped at exception handling, and also we have learned most of the or all of these keywords that are available to handle exception. So today we are going to actually elaborate our knowledge about exception handling, and we are going to look into some more examples and codes that will help you understand exception handling very efficiently. So as we know that exception handling is an abnormal condition, or exception means an abnormal condition, and exception is an event that disrupt the normal flow of program, and it is an object which is thrown at the runtime. So what is it? They are basically interruption in a normal flow of program. That means even if an exception is occurring in your program, then the normal execution of that program or normal flow of that program will interrupt and program will terminate at that particular position. So what is the exception handling? So exception handling is nothing but a mechanism that can handle this kind of errors like class not found error, I exception error, SQL exception, remote exception, and also arithmetic exception, index array index out of bound exception, string index out of bound exception, and all this kind of exception. So what are the advantages of exception? So look at this particular scenario. So look at this particular scenario where we have suppose 10 statements that are needed to be executed one after another. Now suppose in this particular line or in this particular point, that is statement number 5, some exception has occurred. So what will happen in normal scenario? Suppose consider a normal scenario. So in normal scenario, what will happen? The program will terminate at this particular position. Sorry. So the program will terminate at this particular position. That means the rest of the statements like statement 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 are not going to execute. So that is what happening in normal scenario if you don't actually manage the exception or if you don't actually handle the exception. But what will happen if we have handled scenario? So if you have somehow handled or managed the exception at statement 5, then rest of the statement, so program execution will be executing statement 1, 2, 3 and 4. Then exception is occurring at number 5, then handled, so they will be handled properly, and then it will execute 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10. So all the statements are going to execute. So this is the advantage of exception handling. That means your program will not end abruptly, or that means your program will execute until exit statement is found in your program. So this is the advantage of exception handling. So let's look at the exception hierarchy. So these are all classes. So first the object class is inherited, or if we say all the exception and errors are under throwable class. So this is the main class of any exception and error that might occur in your Java program. And this throwable class is an extension of object class. So object is the base class of all these classes you can see behind. So throwable actually inherits the properties of object class and creates a class that defines some errors as well as some exceptions. So these exceptions are again inherited by this class throwable, or this exception inherits throwable class, And these exceptions are of two categories. One is unchecked exceptions. So that means these unchecked exceptions are not oh sorry first of all, checked exceptions. So these are checked at the time of compilation. That means you cannot ignore, or the programmer cannot ignore, this kind of exceptions, whereas we have some unchecked exceptions that compiler doesn't check. So these exceptions, compiler don't check these exceptions, and programmers need to handle them by cells, or programmers may ignore them, and it will cause uninterrupted or interrupted execution of your program. So this kind of errors, like runtime exception or null pointer exceptions, like of things, this kind of things can only be occur at the time of running. Compiler cannot detect them at any cost, like a exception like int a is equal to 5 divided by 0. So this kind of scenarios cannot be detected by the compiler, and they are comes under this unchecked exception categories. And in checked exception category, we have some IO exception. So this is one of the example of checked exceptions. So we are going to look into the examples how these checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions are occurring, or what is happening when we have a unchecked exception in our program, and what is happening when we have a checked exception in our program. And there is errors. So these errors are unavoidable. You cannot avoid, or you cannot rectify yourself from an error. So error can be something virtual machine error, or assertion error, something like this, or power search. So these errors cannot be rectifiable, but exception can be rectifiable. Either it is checked or unchecked, doesn't matter. It can be rectifiable. You can rectify your system, or you can rectify your program from this kind of exception situations. So there are three type of exceptions basically. So one is checked, that is that are can be identified by the compiler, and a programmer cannot ignore this kind of exceptions. So one must resolve this kind of exception, or you must throw those kind of exceptions to the compiler, so that compiler can actually handle those kind of errors. Whereas in case of unchecked exceptions, so compiler cannot detect this kind of exception, and they are generated at the time of running of your program. So when you encounter those kind of exceptions, you can then put your try and catch blocks to actually handle this kind of exceptions. And error, they are unavoidable, and you cannot return from this kind of scenario. So if an error occurs in your program, you cannot return to the normal flow of your program. So there are three type of exception. So you have heard this term, try, catch, finally, throws, finally, throw, and throws. So these are basically the keywords that are help in exception handling in Java, in which try and catch are the basic way of handling any exception. So what try does, so try actually enclosed all the suspicious code that I have said in earlier classes as well, that in it enclose all the suspicious code, or the codes that you might think can have some exceptions. So we put those type of codes in this try block. Cache is used to actually handle the exception. So this is the block that actually handles the exception. So whatever exception, or whatever error, not error, whatever exceptions has occurred inside the try block can be catched through this catch block, and it can be handled by this catch block. So it must be proceed by try block, which means we cannot use catch block alone. So that is again true. That means catch block cannot be used without a try block. Then we have this finally block. So finally block is used to execute the important code of program. It is executed whether an execution is handled or not. So what I said, so this is also I mentioned in previous class, that is whatever we kept in this finally block will going to execute. So the situation is like that. Suppose in this particular scenario you have 10th statement, and at statement 5, you have some error occurred. Okay, so what I said, in normal execution, this is our termination. So this is our termination at normal execution. But if you have some blocks of code, so suppose you have put it inside try block, you have put this particular block inside a try block, and you have not catched that particular exception. That means you have not tried to handle that particular exception, but you have just caught it using try. Sorry, you have just detected using try, and you have this statement 9 and statement 10 at finally block. So now what will happen in normal execution? This is our termination. But even though this is our termination, statement 9 and statement 10 is going to execute. So whatever inside a finally block is going to execute regardless of any exception is occurring in that particular situation, or you are handling that exception. That means even though you are not handling that exception, that final block is going to execute. Hmm. না, আমি যদি ক্যাশটা না দিই, আমি যদি ট্রাই শুধু রাখি, তাহলে we must have if we use a try block within our code, it must be cached by sorry, it must, the exception from the try block can be cached, or can should be cached by at least one catch block, or it should be followed by a finally block. That means you can either use try and finally, or you can use try catch finally, or you can use try catch, but you must all the errors that are detected inside the try must be followed by either a finally block or a catch block. So দুটোর মধ্যে যে কোনো একটা থাকতেই হবে if we use try. If you don't use try, then দুটোর মধ্যে একটা না থাকলেও no problem. But if we use try block, we must have at least one catch block, or at least one, or only one final block. So there in your program, the catch can be multiple. You can have multiple catch boxes one after another, but in case of finally, we must have only one final block, or only one finally block is permitted to the program. So in a single program, or in a single code, single block, you must have only one finally block. Then we have a throw. A throw keyword used to throw an exception. So it is throwing an instance. We are going to look at some examples as well. And this throws keyword, so the throws keyword is used to declare exceptions, like we have declared like public static void main string args throws IO exception. So this is how we use throws. So another interesting thing is that throw is used inside a function with an instance of an exception, whereas function is actually sorry, throws actually used at the declaration of that particular function. That means at the header of that particular function. So you can throw multiple exception using throws keyword. So we are going to take a look at some examples of these throw and throws as well. So some common exceptions that you can see in any Java program, like arithmetic exception. So this is a divide by zero exception, or zero error, and that is arithmetic exception. So here in this particular situation, we have a string that has nothing. That means it has null. So if you want to print the length of that particular string, so it says null pointer exception. That means we have found null. That means this string doesn't contain anything to find out the length of. Then we have this particular instruction, or this particular set of instruction, where we have a string s is equal to abc, and now you have you have heard this, that is integer dot percent is used to convert some string to an integer. But if that string contains character, not digits, characters like alphabets, so it cannot be converted to an integer. So at that particular time, number format exception can occur. Uh, then similarly, we have an integer that is of size 5. So we know that if the integer size is 5, the index is 0 to 4, that is size minus 1. So at that particular time, you cannot actually access this a is equal to, or a uh, 10 equal to 50. So this is array index out of bound exception. Now I have a question for you guys. So suppose this particular scenario, and we have a 5, sorry, suppose a5 is equal to uh, a2 divided by 0. What will happen here, and what kind of exception might generate from here? Anyone? A5, suppose there is an array, that is the A array of size 5, and we want to access the fifth, or rather sixth element here, fifth indexed element is equal to A2 divided by 0. What kind of error or what kind of exceptions might generate here? That means it may be more than 2, or more than 1, or more than 2, or and also which exception will generate first? That is my question to you guys. Anyone? ওকে, এনিথিং এলস? লিখে লাভ নেই, চ্যাট খুলতে পারছি না এখন। শুধুই কি অ্যারিথমেটিক এক্সেপশন জেনারেট হতে পারে এখান থেকে? না, হোয়াট ইজ দ্য প্রবাবিলিটি, হোয়াট আর দ্য ডিফারেন্ট এক্সেপশনস? অনলি অ্যারিথমেটিক? হুম হুম, আর অ্যারিথমেটিক দুটো, দুটোর মধ্যে কোনটা আগে হবে? Yes, so this is like L value is equal to R value, and always R value is calculated first. So that means this particular value will be calculated first. So when this value is going to be calculated, we have this arithmetic exception. So uh, so this value is calculated first, then it is assigned here. So when we are going to assign at that particular time, array index out of bound exception will generate. So here there are two possibilities of exception, like array index out of bound exception and arithmetic exception, though the arithmetic exception is going to generate first. Yes. Simple. A5, is it a valid index? We have the size 5, right? The array size is 5. Array size 5 means the index will start from 0 to size minus 1. Size minus 1 means 5 minus 1, that is equal to 4. So indexes are 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So 5 is not a valid index. This is not a valid index. This is an invalid index. That's why. বোঝা গেছে? হুম, এই তো এইটাই তো আমি বললাম এক্ষুনি। এল ভ্যালু is equal to r value equation, এটা ক্লাস, মানে এটা অ্যাকচুয়ালি সি এর এরিয়া, l value is equal to r value whenever we have assignment operator. So this is assignment. So whenever we have assignment operator, always the r value is being calculated first. r value তে যা আসে সেটা আগে ক্যালকুলেট হবে, then only that particular thing or that particular result from this r value expression or r value is going to assign into l value. So first of all this one will be calculated. So এখানে যখন ক্যালকুলেট হচ্ছে তখনই আমি তো এই এররটা পেয়ে যাচ্ছি, তারপরে আমি যখন অ্যাসাইন করতে যাচ্ছি এখান থেকে যে ভ্যালুটা পেলাম দ্যাট ইজ দ্য nan ভ্যালু হবে obviously. So this value is then being assigned to this particular a5. So that is not going to happen because ওখানেই আমার এররটা পেয়ে যাচ্ছি. So r value is always calculated first, then it is assigned to l value. এটা কমন সেন্স, জাস্ট ম্যাথেও তাই হয়। আমি যদি ম্যাথে a ইকুয়াল টু 5+2 লিখি, সো অবভিয়াসলি 5+2 আগে কম্পিউট হবে, তো কম্পিউট করতে গিয়ে যদি এররটা আসে তাহলে ওই এররটা আগে ক্যালকুলেট আগে ধরবে নাকি বা সাইডে যে এররটা আছে সেটা আগে ধরবে? So that's why that particular error will come first. Okay, so let's look at some examples from web as well as from machines. So first of all, let's check, or let's see unchecked exception. So what I said about unchecked exception, so they are not going to catch, or they are not going to encountered by the compiler. So we have this kind of situation. So we have a class unchecked exception class. Okay. Uh, okay. So we have a class unchecked exception. So this is our class name. So file name is also unchecked exception.java. And inside that we have public static void. Ignore this part. So this is part of the IDE. I have nothing to do with it. So public static void main string args. We have two variables. One is int a is equal to 0, and another one is suppose b is equal to 5 divided by 0. Now, so here, as you can see, we have an arithmetic exception, right? Arithmetic exception. And the reason being divide by 0. So that is the reason why this arithmetic exception has occurred. Now we have the next line, that is system.out.println hello world. Yes. All mostly most of the errors, most of the exception classes are there present. এটা আগের দিনও জাস্ট দেখিয়েছিলাম, আগের দিন জানি না ক্লাস করেছিলি না, আগের দিন আমি অনেকগুলো এক্সেপশনের নাম দেখিয়েছিলাম যেগুলো অলরেডি প্রিডিফাইন্ড রিটেন আছে, and the the father class of those exceptions are exception class. Exception class is the father class of all the exceptions, and throwable class is actually the father of exception class, and object class is the father of throwable class. এইরকম করে হায়ারার্কিটা ছিল, হায়ারার্কিটা দেখালাম একটু আগে, আর জাস্ট we can generate our own exceptions as well. আমরা সেটাও দেখবো যে কি করে exception generate করতে হয়. That is also the part of your course. So int b is equal to 5 divided by 0. We can clearly say that there is an arithmetic exception, but compiler cannot see or cannot actually detect this kind of error. That's why they are called unchecked exception. So what we have to do, we have to execute this particular, or we have to, first of all, we have to compile this particular file. So what we are trying to write, Java C used for compiling in Java program or Java file, then unchecked. So we have this unchecked exception.java. So it is, the compilation is successful. So what I have to do, we have to just mention the class name with the Java keyword. So Java unchecked exception. This was our class name. So just run it. So as you can see, at the time of running, we have this kind of error. It is saying arithmetic exception, and the reason being divided by 0. So what is happening here? This particular type of exception cannot be detected by the compiler. That's why they are called unchecked. That means compiler cannot check this kind of exception. And it is user's responsibility to actually identify this kind of error and do the necessary things that can be done to handle this kind of exception. And then we have this checked exception. That means this kind of errors can be checked by the compiler itself. So as I said, that whenever we have something related to input, except the scanner class, we must throw an IO exception for that particular function, in which function we have that particular type of operations. So in this scenario, so you have learned, I guess, 2 or 3 methods in previous class to take inputs from user. In this class, there is another new method, so that is input stream reader combining with buffered reader. So this is how we are going to take inputs using input stream reader. So I am not going to explain how this is happening, because that is not what we are looking for. We are looking for exception. So assume that this particular line is used to define this BR object of buffer reader class, and this particular line is actually taking the input br.readLine. So this is used to take take inputs using this BR object of buffer reader class. So this is an input related program, right? So in input related program, it might generate an IO exception or input out exception. So what we used to do, we used to write throws IO exception. Throws IO exception. So this throws IO exception tells the user, tells the compiler that there must be and there is an exception, and you can handle it by your own. I am not going to handle it. 1 second, okay. Hello, ক্লাস নিচ্ছি। এই একটা অবধি নেব। কি করছিস? So, uh, so it tells the compiler that handle this particular error if occurs by your own. Uh, so what is happening here? If you don't put IO exception, what will happen? So in the previous example, unchecked exceptions, the compilation was very much successful. At the time of running, we have encounter with that particular exception. Let's see what is happening in this particular scenario. So we have Java C. The name is checked exception.java. So at the time of compilation, that you can see that unreported exception IO exception. That means for this particular read instance or read line instance, that means for this particular input statement, we must throw an IO exception. That means we must quote that IO exception either, or we must throw that IO exception to the compiler so the compiler can handle it by its own. That means if you don't put IO exception, throws IO exception in this particular fashion or in this particular function, the compiler will not let you compile your code. That means compiler have detected your error or detected your exception, and you must handle that error. So that what I said, that in case of checked exception, the programmer cannot ignore that particular exception. So what we can do, or what is the solution? The solution is putting throws error. So putting throws IO exception will handle it to the compiler, and if you just compile the same program, wait a sec. Same exception. Java.io.star. বলছি কেন বাফার রিডার ইউজ করলে, বাফার রিডার শুধু না, যে কোনো ইনপুট ইনপুট রিডার বা যে কোনো ইনপুটের ক্লাস ইউজ করলেই আমাকে আইও এক্সেপশন থ্রো করতে হয়। But the problem is, হুম, EXE, আচ্ছা। Yes. So as you can see, if you just don't, if you just don't give this throws IO exception, it will give an error that unexpected unreported exception, IO exception. That means you must caught or declare to be thrown. So as you can see, it is saying you must caught or declare to be thrown. Caught means you can caught this or you can catch this particular type of exception using a catch block, or you must throw that so that compiler can does its job. And now if you just write this throws IO exception, it will not. So it will not generate that particular error. That means you can move forward and actually execute your program. So let's execute this particular code. So for that you have to write Java checked exception. So enter your name. So I am writing suppose Raymond. So as you can see, it is executing perfectly. And not for only buffer reader or input stream reader, whichever input operation we are using or we are going to use for all these scenarios, the IO exception must be thrown. That means a exception must generate or must be handled at that particular scenario, except if you are using scanner class, because if you are using scanner class, I think by default it handles the IO exception itself. So you don't have to actually manage those IO exception. But instead of buffer class, if you use any, instead of scanner class, if you use any kind of uh, say any kind of input related classes or any kind of input related functions, you must throw that IO exception. We can actually uh, throw multiple exceptions here as well. So suppose this is IO exception that you have actually seen here. Suppose we have suppose ভুল কিছু থাকবে না, জেনারেলি কম্পাইলার ধরেই নেয় যে if the whoever the user or whoever is using that particular program might give some inputs that can hamper the flow of your program. So at that situation এই জিনিসটা করতেই হবে। এটা ভুলের জন্য না, যেখানে কোনো ভুল আছে বা কিছু না, এটা জাস্ট একটা কনভেনশন। কোন নর্মাল প্রোগ্রাম? ইম্পসিবল। যদি স্ক্যানার ক্লাস ছাড়া অন্য কোনো ক্লাস ইউজ করে ইনপুট নেওয়া হয়ে থাকে, তাতে যদি আই এক্সেপশন না দেওয়া হয়ে থাকে, দেন জীবনে রান করবে না। তো স্ক্যানার ক্লাসে বলছি তো, স্ক্যানার ক্লাস হ্যান্ডেলস দেম বাই দেমসেলফস। স্ক্যানার ক্লাসের মধ্যেই আই এক্সেপশনটা হ্যান্ডেল করা আছে, তাই জন্য আমাকে ওটাতে মেনশন করতে হয় না। আমি তো বারবার সেটা বলছি যে এক্সেপ্ট স্ক্যানার ক্লাস, অল দ্য আদার ইনপুট ক্লাসেস মাস্ট থ্রো দ্যাট আই এক্সেপশন। স্ক্যানার ক্লাসে হবে না। তো স্ক্যানার ক্লাস হচ্ছে মোর অ্যাডভান্স, মানে মোস্ট অ্যাডভান্সড ক্লাস দ্যাট ইজ ইউজ টু টেক ইনপুটস ইন জাভা প্রোগ্রাম। ওটা তো আমি আগের দিনও বলেছি, আজকেও বললাম কতবার, যে স্ক্যানার ক্লাসে হবে না। স্ক্যানার ক্লাসে আমার আই এক্সেপশন থ্রো করার দরকার নেই। স্ক্যানার ক্লাস ওটা নিজে থেকে হ্যান্ডেল করে। স্ক্যানার ক্লাসের মধ্যে যে ফাংশনগুলো আছে সেগুলো নিজে থেকে ওই এক্সেপশনটাকে হ্যান্ডেল করে নিয়েছে অলরেডি। তাই জন্যই তো ওটা ডেভেলপ হয়ে এখন সবচেয়ে মোস্ট পপুলার ইউজড ইনপুট মেথড অর ইনপুট ক্লাস যদি আমি বলি জাভাতে, সেটা হচ্ছে স্ক্যানার ক্লাস। বোঝা গেছে? স্ক্যানার বাদে যা কিছু ইউজ করবো তাতে আমাকে আইও এক্সেপশন লাগবে। আমরা তাই জন্যই তো স্ক্যানার এখন স্ক্যানারে মুভ করছি, যাতে আমাদেরকে এক্সট্রা এই থ্রোজ আইও এক্সেপশনটা লিখতে না হয়। বুঝলে? এটা জাস্ট দেখানোর জন্য যে আনচেকড আর চেকড কি করে হচ্ছে, আমি জাস্ট বাফার্ড ইনপুট বাফার রেটটা ইউজ করেছি। না হলে আমার যদি কোনো প্রোগ্রামে দরকার ছিল কোনো ইনপুট নেওয়ার, দেন দেন আমি কিন্তু স্ক্যানার ক্লাসই ইউজ করতাম। ঠিক আছে? আমিও এই ইনপুট স্ট্রিম রিডার বা বাফার রিডার ইউজ করতাম না। জাস্ট এটা দেখানোর জন্য যে আনচেকড এক্সেপশন কি, বিকজ বিকজ অনেক কম আনচেকড এক্সেপশন আছে, লাইক ক্লাস নট ফাউন্ড এক্সেপশন। এবার ওটা তো আর দেখানো যায় না। সো তাই জন্য জাস্ট এই এক্সাম্পল নিয়েছি, সো দ্যাট উই ক্যান শো অর আই ক্যান শো দ্যাট হোয়াট ইজ চেকড এক্সেপশনস। বোঝা গেছে? So suppose let's include some or just don't hamper this. Suppose save as exception handling 1, suppose. So now it is exception handling 1. So just rename this particular class exception handling 1. Now I guess everything is right. Let's check it. Java C exception handling 1.java. Yes, everything is perfectly correct. And just if you execute this, so as you can say, enter your name. So the program is running fine. Now we include some more errors, suppose int a is equal to 5 divided by 0. So as we have seen in our previous unchecked exception uh, example, that this particular exception will not be caught by the compiler. That means this particular program will compile successfully. So let's check it. So first of all, save it. So Control S and then just save. So as you can see, that particular error cannot be detected by the compiler. Now what will happen? It has generated an error slash divide by 0. Now there are two ways to handle it. One, by yourself. Okay, by yourself means we can use try catch block, or we let the compiler handle it. So what you can do, you can throw multiple exceptions. So IO exceptions, and possibly here we can have arithmetic exception. So write arithmetic exception. So we can throw multiple exceptions from a particular function, and at this particular time, at this particular situation, all this code is a suspicious code. That means if you use this throws keyword along with exception list, your whole code in this particular function becomes suspicious. That means you can consider them to be inside a try block, that is equivalent to inside a try block. So this particular code is in now try block. Suppose this is in a try block. So this kind of situation might occur. So if you just compile it, so compiling and then going to execute this. So as you can see, this is handled by the compiler. So this is handled by the compiler. So when compiler handles this, we don't have any control over the over how it is going to execute or how it is going to terminate. So when compiler handles some error, the program is bound to terminate. So what we have to do, we have to actually not let this kind of errors handled by the compiler, but we must handle it by our own using try catch block. So this particular code is suspicious. So this particular code is suspicious. So just enclose this particular code within that try block. Now what kind of error may generate? So we know that in this particular case, arithmetic exception will be generated. So arithmetic exception E, and just print whatever there is, system.out.println. Suppose E. So now we have actually uh, captured our error and also handled our error. So suppose just include this one as well. So name, comma, A equal to, suppose A. Let's modify our code. Control C, Control X. So the compilation is successful. Now if you execute this particular code, oh sorry. So as you can see, we have handled our exception, right? So we have handled this kind of exception, and it is printed by this particular line that java.lang arithmetic exception divides by 0. Now the rest of the code is going to execute. As you can see, the rest of the code is going to execute. Now it is asking enter your name. So I am entering, say, Riman. So it is giving the output, welcome Riman, A is equal to. So I have forget to mention two things, one space here and then plus, then A, the value of the variables. So just recompile, just recompile and re-execute the program. So as you can see, the exception is handled. That is why the programmer is not terminating by itself. Instead, it is going to execute the rest of the code. So as you can see, welcome Rimon, A is equal to 0 is now is the output. So that is why I have kept A is equal to here. So what I did, I declared the variable outside this try block and then try to modify that particular variable. So if we don't generate any exception, what will happen? So suppose this is 5 divided by 2. If, so in this particular scenario, we are not going to generate any error. So what will happen? Let's check it. So just compile the program again and execute the program. So as you can see, there is no error. So there is no error. So this particular line is printing enter your name. So I am giving Raymond. So as you can see, welcome Raymond, A is equal to 2. So because I have put this particular line here, the program is executing very efficiently. If I put it here, what will happen? You can just see. So it has already caught a compilation time error. Sorry, not. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so as you can see that there is a compilation time error, that is A is not found. Why? Because A is declared inside the try block, and we know from the scope of a particular variable that a variable is only accessible within that particular block and visible within that particular block. So if you write int A is equal to 5 divided by 2, it might not actually work. That's why we have put this particular instruction here. So any questions regarding how we use try and catch block in a simple fashion and how it actually changes the flow of your program? That means it actually remove that particular exception as well as uh, bring back your normal flow of your program until the program ends with the end of main. So anyone has any questions on this exception handling or use of try catch block in this particular fashion? এটা হচ্ছে একটা ভেরিয়েবল, এক্সেপশন ক্লাসের একটা ভেরিয়েবল আমাকে জেনারেট করতে হয়, যে ভেরিয়েবলটা ইউজ করে আমি এরর যে মেসেজটা আছে সেই মেসেজটা প্রিন্ট করতে পারবো। ওটা জাস্ট একটা ভেরিয়েবল। ইয়েস। ও এক্সেপশন, না এক্সেপশন ক্লাসের একটা অবজেক্ট আমার লাগবে, ক্যাচের মধ্যে এক্সেপশন ক্লাসের একটা অবজেক্ট লাগবে, সো উই হ্যাভ টু ক্রিয়েট দ্যাট পার্টিকুলার অবজেক্ট। সো বোঝা গেছে হাউ দিস ট্রাই অ্যান্ড ক্যাচ ব্লক ইজ গোয়িং টু হ্যাপেন। অ্যান্ড যে চেকড এক্সেপশনের মধ্যে যেটা ছিল লাইক থ্রোজ আইও এক্সেপশন, আমি যদি চাই আমি এই থ্রোজ আইও এক্সেপশনটাকে তুলেও দিতে পারি। কি করে তুলতে পারি? সো দিস ওয়াজ আওয়ার কোড যেখানে আমার এররটা আসছিল, তো সেটাকে কি করতে হবে, ট্রাই ক্যাচের মধ্যে ফেলে দিতে হবে। try. কি এরর ছিল? IO, sorry, exception. IO exception E. And here, what we are going to do, we are going to set default name. So is equal to name is equal to, suppose, default name. So we have removed this, and we have this particular statement string. So we have to make it like this: Control C, Control. Anyone has any question on this regard? What we have done, we have removed the throw statement. We have captured the IO exception by ourselves. Okay. So, so as you can see, this was checked exception, right? So this was the example of checked exception. That means you have to handle uh, or this particular line was had to be thrown using throws I exception, but we have not thrown it. But it still did not generate that kind of error. Why? Because we have manually handled it. So there was written that either you have to caught it. So we have caught here. We have not thrown anything. We have caught that IO exception. That's why no error has been generated in this particular scenario, and the program will execute efficiently. So just remove them. Just remove them. Put space. Enter. So enter your name. So I am suppose entering my name, and as you can see, welcome ASJHAKS. So uh, I don't know which kind of error might generate. For that, you will have this default name displayed. So I cannot show you showing how this default name is going to generate. So I actually don't know what kind of error will occur in case of IO. Maybe the IO fails, maybe the pass fails, maybe the buffer fails. So some kind of error might occur that I cannot manually generate. So if those kind of error occurs and the file or the read statement is not happening or not going to happen, then this default name will be the default value of this name. So can you get it now how we can use this catch block to actually handle the error? So you can do this kind of activities here as well. So suppose you have uh, this particular value to be suppose here we take an integer value as an input. So int b, uh, we say suppose b is equal to integer dot percent. Here we have to use br dot readline. So we are actually taking input and converting that particular input into an integer. So here we can have a error like suppose what was the number format exception error, right? And here for this particular situation, here we can have an error like divisible by 0, that is arithmetic exception. Now we have one cache block, but we can have multiple cache block in this scenario. So we have to put them in order. So first error that can occur, that is say, so the first error, that is number format exception error. So let me confirm what is the name, actual name. So number format exception. So I guess this is the exception name. So I am just copying it. So I am catching number, sorry, number format exception E, and inside that what I am trying to say or what I am trying to write is, suppose A equal to 10, or 0. We are actually changing the value of A by dividing B divided, so this is 10 suppose. So what I am trying to write here, I am trying to set the value to its default value, say B is equal to 1. Because if B is equal to 0, if you set B is equal to 0 here, what will happen? It will again generate that particular error divisible by our arithmetic expression divisible by 0. So we are setting that B is equal to 8 by default. If some error occur on that in that particular scenario, so this kind of thing we can do to resolve that particular error, and we remove this particular line, or keep it. So just keep this particular line as well as a message to you guys that what is happening. So it will print number format exception error, it will print arithmetic exception error, and in this scenario also in this particular section we are actually assigning the value to 0, or by the default value, that is 10. So we are again assigning the value to 10. So anyone has any questions in this regard? ফার্স্ট ট্রাইতে বি এর ভ্যালুটা কোথায় থেকে পাবো? আমার পাওয়ার দরকার নেই তো। যদি এখানে কোনো এরর থাকে, কখন এরর থাকবে? পার্সেন্ট, পার্সেন্ট কি কাজ করে? ইন্টিজার ভ্যালু ইনপুট দেবো তো। সো সাপোজ আমি যদি ইনপুটটা দিই এ বি সি, এটা যদি আমার ইনপুট হয়, সো এটা তো রিড লাইন, সো রিড লাইন রিডস আ স্ট্রিং, দেন সেই স্ট্রিংটাকে ইন্টিজারে কনভার্ট করার জন্য উই ইউজ ইন্টিজার ডট পার্সেন্ট। সো এবিসি যদি আমি ইনপুট দিই, সেটা কি কখনোই বি বি ভ্যালুতে আসতে পারবে? বি তো একটা ইন্টিজার। আরে এই তো ইনপুট নিচ্ছি। ও আচ্ছা, ইনপুট স্টেটমেন্টটা নেই তাই জন্য। আরে ইনপুট স্টেটমেন্ট, একটা মেসেজ প্রিন্টিং করা আর ইনপুট নেওয়া ডিফারেন্ট থিং। আমি বিআর ডট রিড লাইন দিয়ে ইনপুটটা নিচ্ছি। মেসেজ যদি প্রিন্ট করতে হয় তাহলে আমাকে এরকম করে প্রিন্ট করতে হবে, সিস্টেম ডট আউট ডট প্রিন্টএলএন। প্রিন্টিং মেসেজ ইজ ডিফারেন্ট থিং। enter the value of b, so this is a message to the user, but input তো আমি এই লাইনটা দিয়ে নিচ্ছি। এইটা এইটা হচ্ছে একটা মেসেজ, ইনপুট নেওয়ার লাইন তো আমার এটা। বোঝা গেছে? সো মেসেজটা আমি উপরেই দিলাম, সো এন্টার দ্য ভ্যালু অফ পি সাপোজ। আর কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন? মানে এটাই কোয়েশ্চেন ছিল তো তোর, যে ইনপুটটা নিচ্ছি না কেন? তো বি এর ভ্যালুটা পাচ্ছি রিড লাইন ইনপুট দিয়ে। ইনপুট নেওয়ার জন্য তো আমাকে এটা, এই মেসেজটা যে আমাকে প্রিন্ট করতেই হবে তার তো কোনো বাধ্যবাধকতা নেই। মেসেজ লাইনটা তুলে দেবো বলতে, মানে দেবো না মেসেজ লাইন? হ্যাঁ, এই তো ইনপুট বিআর ডট রিড লাইন, এই মেথডটা দিয়ে ইনপুট নেবে। এক্সিকিউট করলে বুঝতে পারবি যে ইনপুট নিচ্ছে, ওটা কার্সারটা ওয়েট করে বসে থাকবে যতক্ষণ না আমি ইনপুট দিচ্ছি। এনি আদার কোয়েশ্চেন? আর কারোর? সো আমরা এখানে দুটো জিনিস করেছি, দুই টাইপের এক্সেপশন জেনারেট করেছি, একটা হচ্ছে নাম্বার ফরম্যাট এক্সেপশন, একটা হচ্ছে অ্যারিথমেটিক এক্সেপশন। আর সেই অর্ডারেই আমাকে অ্যাকচুয়ালি দেওয়া উচিত এক্সেপশন গুলো। আর যদি আমি জানি না যে কোন টাইপের এক্সেপশন জেনারেট হতে পারে, দেন উই হ্যাভ the father of all exception, that is exception. If you don't know what you have to do, so you just set b is equal to 1 and a is equal to 10 suppose. So this is the father of all exception. সো যখনই আমি এক্সেপশন ক্লাসটা সবার উপরে, এই এক্সেপশন ক্লাসটা যদি আমি সবার উপরে ইউজ করে দিই, তাহলে কি হবে? বাকি এক্সেপশন গুলো ওভারলুক করে দেবে। সো বেটার টু ইউজ ইন দ্য অর্ডার the exception might occur, and then if you don't know some exception that might occur, then you can put this particular exception line at the end, like default case in case of uh, সুইচ কেস স্টেটমেন্ট, যেখানে সবগুলো কেস ম্যাচ না করলে দেন অনলি দ্যাট পার্টিকুলার স্টেটমেন্ট অর দ্যাট পার্টিকুলার ব্লক ইজ গোয়িং টু এক্সিকিউট। বোঝা গেছে? সো আমি কি এক্সিকিউট করব নাকি কেউ এখনো কোনো কোশ্চেন করবে এখানে? So as you can see, the compilation is successful, and now just execute it. So as you can see, it is waiting for our input because of this particular line, integer dot percent read line. So let's first give a correct input. So that is 20. So 10 though, suppose 5. So now it is asking for enter your name. So my name is Raymond, suppose. So welcome Raymond, A is equal to. So everything is fine because we have given the input of B is absolutely correct. Okay. So now let's generate this arithmetic exception and let's see what is happening. So execute it. So it is waiting for our input. So I am giving 0. So if I give the value of 0, B0 here, so number format exception will not occur. So 0 is a valid integer. So 0 will be assigned to B and you divide 10 divided by 0. That will generate this arithmetic exception and it will convert the value of A is equal to 10. So here it will print welcome, my name, A is equal to 10. So I have given 0, enter. So as you can see, we have our exception generated, but still it is requesting for my name. So I am giving my name and it is saying welcome Raymond, A is equal to 10. So you can see that how efficiently we have handled the exception and the program is not abruptly terminated at that particular position. Clear? Now, let us generate the number format exception. So, how we can generate that number format exception? We give ABC as the input. So, this is not a valid integer. So, what will happen? So, it has generated a number format exception. Okay. So, as it is generated number format exception, so the value of B will be 1, and because of that, here we will see A is equal to 0. Am I right or am I wrong? We have set the value of B is equal to 1 because a number format exception has occurred. But still we are going to find the value of A is equal to 0. Why? Or is it, am I correct? মানে আমার জাস্ট একটা অ্যাজাম্পশন, এটা কিন্তু হ্যাঁ আমি কারেক্ট না ইনকারেক্ট সেটা তো জাস্ট বলতে হবে। আমি বললাম যে here we have given ABC, so we have generated number format exception. Okay, that means we are in this particular block where we have set the value of A is equal to 1. Now the value of A B is equal to 1, that is fine. But what I am trying to say, whenever I am trying to print the value of A here, it will be 0, not 10. Because 10 divided by 1, it should be 10, right? But I am saying the value that is going to print is 1. Am I correct? If not, why? If yes, why? 10 হওয়ার কথা না, একই হওয়ার কথা, একই প্রিন্ট হবে, কিন্তু আমি কি সেটা ঠিক বলছি নাকি 10 হওয়ার কথা, 10 প্রিন্ট হবে, নাকি আমি যেটা বলছি সেটা ঠিক? কারণ আমি বি এর ভ্যালুটা কিন্তু রেকটিফাই করে দিয়েছি, বি এবিসি আসলেও বি কিন্তু ওয়ানই হয়ে যাবে অটোমেটিক্যালি। কিন্তু তার জন্য কি এই লাইনটাতে কোনো এক্সিকিউশনে কোনো ইফেক্ট করবে বি ইকুয়াল টু ওয়ান? আগে এক্সিকিউট হয়নি। সো হোয়াট ইজ হ্যাপেনিং, whenever exception is generated, up to that point, at the end of the, starting from that particular point and end of the try block, no more statement is going to execute. That means এই লাইনে যখন এক্সেপশন জেনারেট করেছে, so this exception is called by this number format exception, and the rest of the remaining lines that are inside the try block will not going to execute. That means this line will never going to execute again, and we have b is equal to 1. So b is equal to 1, that is fine, but what is the default value of a? A is equal to 0. So the value of a never changed actually. So that's why the value of a will be 0. So as you can see, Yarima, so as you can see, the value of a is equal to 0. So you can change the value of a also. So what you have to do, you have to just mention. So whenever you change the number format, so because the output that we want is a, you should actually perform the same operation here as well. So 10 divided by b. Okay, so that means we have to redundant these two statements. So these two statements are redundant in this particular scenario. If you just compile this and execute, the result will be, so it is waiting. So as you can see, welcome RR, A is equal to 10. So now the value is 10. But if you want to this particular statement to execute every time, so what you can do? You can put this particular block of code inside the finally block. So at that time, that particular code is going to execute uh, uh, even though the exception is caught or the exception is not caught. But that situation will again create an exception of divisible by zeros. If you put this particular block in finally, it again might create divisible by zero error if the value of b is zero. So we are not going to that far. So this is how you can actually manage this exception handling. And if you want, just remove this particular code. So we now have only one block, that is the exception block. Okay. So now we have only one block, that is the exception block. So let just check what is happening if we have only one block and these two blocks are removed. Here we have set the values of a is equal to 1 and a is equal to 10. So just compile it and execute it. And first of all, let's give 0. So as you can see, even though we have not any arithmetic exception error, the exception class has already caught the java.lang arithmetic exception divided by 0. That means it has already set a is equal b is equal to 1, a is equal to 10. Okay, so the exception has generated in this particular line. So the value here will be 10. So welcome RR, a is equal to 10. And if we have a number format exception, suppose something like this, and you enter say gh. So as you can see, welcome gh, a is equal to 10. Now why a is equal to 10? Because in this particular exception or the base exception, we have set the values of b and a both. That's why in this particular scenario, we have this kind of result. So is it clear how exceptions are handled? কোনটা? এটা শুধু এক্সেপশন রেখে তো? না, দেখাবে না, 10ই দেখাবে। এই লাইনটা তো আমার এক্সিকিউট হচ্ছে না, আর এই লাইনটা তো আমার ফার্দার আর এক্সিকিউট হচ্ছে না, বোঝা গেছে? এই লাইনটা আমার ফার্দার এক্সিকিউট হচ্ছে না, তো ওই লাইনটা কখনোই দেখাবে না, মানে ওই লাইনটা কখনোই এক্সিকিউট হচ্ছে না। তাইলে আমাকে কি করতে হবে, এ বি সেট করে আবার এখানে এ ইকুয়াল টু এ ডিভাইডেড বাই বি সেট করতে হবে, তাহলেই শুধুমাত্র এর ভ্যালু ওইটা আসবে। হুম। না না, এটা কি ফাংশন কল নাকি? এটা ফাংশন কল না তো, এখানে কোনো ফাংশন কল করেছি আমি? ক্যাচে ব্লকটাকে কি কল করেছি? এটা ফাংশন কল না তো। ট্রাই এ যখনই আমি একটা এই লাইনটাতে সাপোজ এক্সিকিউট মানে এক্সেপশন জেনারেট করলো, এই লাইনটা আর কোনোদিনও এক্সিকিউট করবে না। রেস্ট অফ দ্য কেসেস, রেস্ট অফ দ্য লাইনস উইল এক্সিকিউট। ট্রাই ব্লকের মধ্যে যেই লাইনে এক্সেপশনটা জেনারেট করলো, তারপর থেকে ট্রাই ব্লকের এন্ড অবধি কোনো লাইন আর ফার্দার এক্সিকিউট করবেই না। It will be caught, that particular exception will be caught by one of the cache block, আর ক্যাচে ব্লক যদি না থাকে, দ্য ফাইনালি ব্লকে যেই পোর্শন অফ কোডটা আছে সেই কোডটা এক্সিকিউট করবে। বোঝা গেছে? So I am keeping this. Now let's move into some online examples that I have collected. So this is from javapoint.com, where we have some examples. We are going to explore those examples only for your knowledge. Some of them you might find repetitive, that you have already you have already seen in your previous example, or in the previous example. So what is happening here? So we have this example one of try catch block. So here what is happening? So it is try catch example one here, divisible by 0. So may throw exception. So it may throw an exception. So as you can see, if you execute this particular code, this rest of the code section is not going to execute. So as you can see, exception in thread main java exception by 0. So the rest of the code, or the rest of the code section, is not going to execute. So whenever exception is caught, the rest of or exception is generated at the time of running, rest of the code is not going to execute. So in this particular try catch examples, we are only talking about unchecked exceptions. Okay. So so most of the exceptions are unchecked exceptions, like array index out of bound, string index out of bound, uh, like number format exceptions, arithmetic exceptions. These exceptions are all unchecked exceptions. So we are talking about unchecked exception. So এই জায়গাটা বোঝা গেল what is happening here. So whenever an exception is generated, হ্যাঁ বল বল। Unchecked means compiler cannot detect them. Only at the time of running those exceptions will be detected. And checked means compiler can detect those errors or detect those kind of compile করার টাইমেই that exception will be generated. That means exception that is generated at the time of compilation, that is checked. Yes. আর unchecked means যেটা compilation টাইমে ধরা পড়বে না, compiler cannot detect those kind of error. You or the programmer have to manage it by running that particular code. কোডটা রান করুন। Yes, divided by 0 is an unchecked exception. Array index out of bound, string index out of bound, all of them are unchecked. চেক করতে পারবে না, মানে মেবি দে আর কাইন্ড অফ লজিক্যাল এরার্স, তাই জন্য চেক করতে পারছে না। মানে অ্যারে ইন্ডেক্স আউট অফ বাউন্ড ইজ অ্যাকচুয়ালি দ্য মিস্টেক অফ, আমি সাপোজ অ্যারে ইন্ডেক্স হচ্ছে 0 to 5, ওকে, কিন্তু আমি যদি লিখি 6, হুজ রেসপন্সিবিলিটি ইজ দ্যাট? আমার অ্যালগরিদম, আমার ডেটা স্ট্রাকচার বলে যে অ্যারে ইন্ডেক্স ইজ 0 to 5 যদি নাম্বার অফ এলিমেন্টস থাকে 6। সো দ্যাট ইজ নট দ্য রেসপন্সিবিলিটি অফ কম্পাইলার, যে প্রোগ্রাম লিখেছে তার ওটা মিস্টেক। দ্যাটস ওয়াই ওই জিনিসটা চেক করে না বা চেক করতে পারে না। সবকিছু কম্পাইলার চেক করতে পারে না, তাহলে তো প্রোগ্রামই লিখে দিতে পারতো কম্পাইলার, তাই না? এগুলো করবে না, এগুলোকে আমাকে ম্যানুয়ালি হ্যান্ডেল করতে হবে। মানে যদি আমি ছেড়ে দিই কম্পাইলার উপর, লাইক থ্রোজ সে অ্যারে ইন্ডেক্স আউট অফ বাউন্ড এক্সেপশন, যদি আমি এটা লিখে ছেড়ে দিই, তাহলে কি হবে? কম্পাইলার উইল ডিটেক্ট দ্যাট পার্টিকুলার এরর অ্যান্ড টার্মিনেট দ্য প্রোগ্রাম অ্যাট দ্যাট পার্টিকুলার লাইন। যেটা আমরা তখন দেখলাম, আমরা কিন্তু অ্যারিথমেটিক এক্সেপশনটাকে থ্রো করার চেষ্টা করেছিলাম, তাতে কি হলো, প্রোগ্রাম আমার ওই পার্টিকুলার লাইনেই টার্মিনেট হয়ে গেছিল। বাট ট্রাই ক্যাচ ব্লক ইউজ করে যখন করলাম, আমার কিন্তু প্রোগ্রামটা টার্মিনেট হয়নি। দ্যাটস ওয়াই আমি ওই জিনিসটা দেখালাম। আর প্লাস আমি এটাও দেখালাম যে আইও এক্সেপশনটাকে কি করে আমরা থ্রো না করে, মানে কম্পাইলারের হাতে না দিয়ে আমরা নিজে থেকে সেই জিনিসটাকে হ্যান্ডেল করতে পারি, আমরা সেই জিনিসটাও কিন্তু করলাম, তাই না? বোঝা গেছে? আরেকটা জিনিস, এইখানেও কিন্তু আমরা রিড করছি, তাই না? এখানেও কিন্তু রিড করছি, দ্যাট মিনস এখানেও কিন্তু আইও এক্সেপশন জেনারেট হওয়ার কথা, বিকজ আমরা এক্সেপশন ক্লাসটা ইউজ করে ফেলেছিলাম। মানে যদি প্রথম ফার্স্ট এক্সাম্পল থেকেই কিন্তু আমরা এক্সেপশন ক্লাসটা লিখে দিয়েছিলাম, আমি 3টে ক্লাসে লিখে দিয়েছিলাম। যদি কম্পাইল করার টাইমে যদি আমি এক্সেপশন ক্লাসটা লেখা না থাকতো, তাহলে কিন্তু আমার জেনারেট করতো একটা এরর, অর করতো না, মেবি এই ফলোড বাই যে আইও এক্সেপশন আছে, এই এক্সেপশনটা হয়তো ধরে নিত। মানে উই ক্যান হ্যাভ মাল্টিপল ট্রাই ব্লকস আফটার দ্যাট ওয়ান ক্যাচে ব্লক, এই ক্যাচে ব্লকটার জন্য মেবি এররটা জেনারেট করেনি। সো এই জিনিসটা আমি বলবো তোরা নিজেরা ট্রাই করে দেখিস, এই ক্যাচে ব্লকটা তুলে দিয়ে, মানে এখানে কোনো ইনপুট না নিয়ে এই জায়গাটাতে দেখবি যে এখানে আই গেস এক্সেপশন ক্লাসটা না দিলে এরর আসবে না। দিলে তো আসবেই না, বিকজ IO exception is a part of exception class, so automatically no error will be generated. But আমি যদি exception ক্লাসটা না দিই, তাহলে কি এরর আসছে? না, আসছে না। যদি না আসে, তাহলে বুঝতে হবে যে this catch block is actually trying to catch that particular exception as well. মানে প্রিভিয়াস যে IO ট্রাই ব্লকটা আছে, সেখান থেকেও কিন্তু এক্সেপশনটা এই ক্যাচে ব্লক দিয়ে ধরা পড়ছে। তো এই জিনিসটা আমি তোদের জন্য ছাড়লাম, সবকিছু এক্সপেরিমেন্ট করলে এখন বহুত টাইম লাগবে এই জিনিস। সো clear example 1, that it actually shows us that the rest of the code will not execute if some exception is occurring at the middle of your program, if you have not sufficient handling mechanism in your program. Now the solution by exception handling. So what is happening here? So in this scenario, we have put our suspicious code into a try block, and then we have arithmetic exception that is called, and the rest of the code will execute this time. We have already seen this example. So we have already seen this example. So as you can see, it will throw an exception and the rest of the code is going to execute. That means whatever line afterwards is going to execute. Now what will happen? Now what will happen if we have some code, the rest of the code inside the try block? If we have the rest of the code inside the try block, what will happen? This is the last thing I was trying to tell you in the last example, that if an exception is occurring inside the try block, the rest of the statement in this try block is not going to execute. So we are handling the try block, that is fine, but the rest of the code inside the try block is not going to happen. So the error is occurring at this particular line, so rest of the code or rest of the try, if you say rest of the try and write system.out.println rest of the code. So what will happen if you execute this particular code? It will first generate this error, it will print the error, then it will print the rest of the code. So rest of the try is not going to execute. So as you can see here, because we don't have the rest of the try or rest of the code in this particular example, so uh, the the output is only the error. That means whatever there in this particular rest of the code section is not going to execute. বোঝা গেছে? So try at that particular point যেখানে আমার try found an exception from starting from that particular point, the end of the try, all the statement in this particular section is not going to execute. So again, I have also mentioned this in the previous example, that a parent class or parent exception class can actually handle the error. So if you don't have the idea what kind of error might generate, you can actually use this exception class. So that is how parent exception class can be used. So the same output is from the second program. You can actually print or give custom messages, like you have found the error, you put your custom message like system.out.println can't divided by 0. We have gone further enough and we have printed some message along with our exception handling tricks, like setting the data value to some other value. So we have also done that. So we have gone a level up from this particular example. কোনো একটা এক্সাম্পলে প্রবলেম হলে কিন্তু আমাকে থামাবে, আমি জাস্ট ভাবছি যে এভরিওয়ান ইজ আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ডিং এভরিথিং এন্ড আই এম জাস্ট মুভিং ফরওয়ার্ড. So this is how they have resolved it. So what they have done, they have performed this particular operation here and resolved the code. So j is equal to 0 and data is equal to suppose 50, and they have found, I is equal to 50, and they have calculated data is equal to I divided by j. So j is equal to 0. So that's why how they have resolved it. So they increase the value of j by 2 and they have printed the result. So as you can see, 25. কেউ বুঝতে না পারলে কিন্তু থামাবে, I am just assuming everyone is understanding everything. So in this example, along with try block, we also enclosed exception code in a catch block. So how it is happening, we have this case, so that is our exception, and we have this case, that is our exception again. So inside the exception block or catch block, we have a statement that might generate an exception. So what will happen in this scenario? So it will happen exception in thread main java lang arithmetic exception by 0, and the rest of the code is not going to execute. So why this line is printed once? Because these are same exceptions. So here exception is generated, that exception is handled carefully in this particular manner. So for this particular exception, we don't have any error message because we have not printed e here. So e is not printed here. So we have not printed e. So that's why one message is there, or no message for this particular line is there, and for this particular line we have that particular error message. So this error message is for this particular line. That means inside the cache block we have some code that might generate an exception. না আসবে না, বিকজ এখানেই তো আমার এক্সেপশন জেনারেট হয়ে যায়। উই মাস্ট হ্যাভ অ্যানাদার ক্যাচ ব্লক টু ট্যাকল দিস। মানে আমি তো ক্যাচ ব্লকটা পার করে চলে গেছি না, ক্যাচ ব্লকের মধ্যেই এই এররটা আছে। না এখানে তো এরর জেনারেট হয়েছে আমার। আমি কি ফার্স্ট এক্সাম্পলটা কি ছিল, যেখানে আমার এক্সেপশন জেনারেট হচ্ছে তারপর থেকে তো রেস্ট অফ দ্য কোড কোনোদিনও এক্সিকিউট করবেই না। তো এখানে যখন আমার রেস্ট অফ, এখানে যখন আমার কোনটা ছিলাম এটা, হ্যাঁ এখানে যখন আমার এক্সেপশন যে জেনারেট হলো এই পার্টিকুলার লাইনে, তারপর থেকে তো রেস্ট অফ দ্য কোড আর জেনারেট করবেই না যতক্ষণ না উই হ্যাভ হ্যান্ডেলড দ্যাট পার্টিকুলার কোড। দ্যাট মিনস এইখানে আমাকে ট্রাই ব্লক ইউজ করতে হবে ইনসাইড দ্য ক্যাচ ব্লক, এন্ড দেন আবার ক্যাচ করতে হবে ইউজিং অ্যারিথমেটিক এক্সেপশন অর এক্সেপশন। না 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 না, ট্রাই এর মধ্যেও যদি থাকে কিছু আর আমি যদি ক্যাচ ব্লক না থাকে আমার, তাহলে প্রথম কথা কম্পাইলারই এরর দেবে যে কিছু নেই। প্রথম কথা যে ট্রাই এর মধ্যে যে এক্সেপশনটা ধরা পড়েছে সেটাকে ধরার জন্য কেউ নেই, প্রথম এরর দেবে। আর যদি থাকে ধরার জন্য, মানে যদি থাকে বলতে In the sense, this is arithmetic error, right? And you are writing catch a null pointer exception দিয়ে ধরলাম সাপোজ দিয়ে সিস্টেম ডট আউট ডট প্রিন্টএলএন রেস্ট অফ দ্য কোড। ওকে, আর আমার কিন্তু এরর জেনারেট করেছে অ্যারিথমেটিক এক্সপ্রেশন, বাট আমার অ্যারিথমেটিক এক্সেপশন ধরার জন্য কোনো ক্যাচে ব্লকই আমি রাখিনি। অ্যাট দ্যাট টাইমও কি হবে, এইখান থেকেই টার্মিনেট করে যাবে, এখান থেকেই আমার টার্মিনেট করবে, বিকজ উই আর নট হ্যান্ডলিং দ্যাট পার্টিকুলার টাইপ অফ এরর। এখান দিয়ে হ্যান্ডেল করেছি আমি, এই ক্যাচে ব্লকটা দিয়ে সেটাকে হ্যান্ডেল করেছি। হ্যান্ডেল করার টাইমে আমরা এরর মেসেজটা কখন দিচ্ছিল, যখন আমরা প্রিন্ট করছিলাম সিস্টেম ডট আউট ডট প্রিন্টএলএন, আউট ডট প্রিন্টএলএন সে প্রিন্টএলএন ই, ইটা যখন প্রিন্ট করছিলাম তখনই মেসেজটা দিচ্ছিল। ইটা যদি প্রিন্ট না করি মেসেজটা কিন্তু দেবে না। তো এখানে এইটা তো প্রিন্ট করা হয়নি, দ্যাট মিন্স মেসেজটা দেবে না। দ্যাট মিন্স ওটা তো এইটার জন্য দিয়েছে, এই লাইনটার জন্য দিয়েছে, পরের লাইনটার জন্য এই মেসেজটা দিয়েছে। এইটাকে যখন হ্যান্ডেল করবো তখন আর ওই লাইনটাও থাকবে না। সো যেটা আমি বললাম সেটাই এখানে দেখানো হয়েছে। we have we have this particular scenario where we have arithmetic exception generated, but we have used array index out of bound exception. In this particular scenario এখান থেকেই program closed, the rest of the action will not execute. See? So another unchecked exception, that is array index out of bound exception. So where we have an array with 4 elements, that means indices will be 0, 1, 2, and 3. But what we are trying to access, we are trying to access index 10, that is array index out of bound. So as you can see, Java lang array index out of bound exception 10. So it is giving the index, which index you are trying to access, that is out of bound. So 10 is the index that is you are trying to access, and that is out of bound. And you have the rest of the code, because we have handled that particular exception very efficiently. Now, so you don't have the knowledge of file programming. So today we may learn what is file programming is. So this is a file programming where we want to write something on this file, and we have handled this file not found exception if this particular file is not found. So file saved successfully, because this particular, in case of file writer or print writer, so print writer is a class that is used to write something on a file. If no file is there, it will create a file, I guess. So that's why file not found exception will not generate in this particular situation. This is, you can learn something from here. So what is happening? An object of exception class is thrown. So when this particular example, this particular thing is occurring, an object of exception class is thrown. Then that exception object is cached, whether it is handled. If it is handled, the rest of the code is going to execute. If it is not handled, print out exception description. So it will print the exception description, print the stack track. Stack track in the sense, what are the calls, what are the function calls that are going to happen. So this these exceptions can propagate to the main function. That means if you have, suppose, three intermediary functions, like suppose you have main function, inside that you have called a function p, inside the definition of p you have called r. Okay, inside the definition of r you have called, suppose you have an exception. So okay, So as you have called this particular function p, exception will generate here, exception will generate here, and a exception is generated here. So this particular exception will propagate to the calling function. So it will generate here, then it will propagate here, and it will propagate here. So that stack trace will be printed here. That means কোন ফাংশন থেকে কোন ফাংশনে যেতে 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 এররটা propagate করেছে, and then terminates the program. Okay, so these things are going to happen. You have, suppose, uh, try and catch used in your program. Then we have multiple catch block in Java. At a time, only one catch occurs. At a time, only one catch block is going to execute. That means at a time, only one exception will occur, and one of these catch block will going to execute. So we have seen this particular example as well. So we have two exceptions here: array index out of bound and this. And I have shown this particular example that array arithmetic exception will occur first, then array index out of bound, and then we have another exception, that is the parent exception. So here arithmetic exceptions occur. In this scenario, we have array index out of bound exception because we don't have any arithmetic exception, though we have written the arithmetic exception code section here. So that is that doesn't mind. The compiler doesn't mind that if you have more than one exception handling codes, and those exceptions are not present in the try. Why compiler doesn't mind that? Because compiler can actually not detect this kind of errors or this kind of exceptions. So it will not mind how many exception or how many catch blocks are there. Then you have this multiple catches. So this is arithmetic exception as well as array index out of bound exception, and this is only the arithmetic exception. And here also only the arithmetic exception part is going to execute. So as you can see, arithmetic exception power. So here, what is happening? The same scenario. We have generated a null pointer exception, yet we don't have those exceptions written. So we have arithmetic exception, we have arithmetic array index out of bound exception, but we have not written null pointer exception. So in that case, what will happen? The parent exception class is going to execute. That is exception class. So parent exception occurs and the rest of the code. So as you can see here, we don't know actually which kind of error might occur. So we have not actually mentioned that particular kind of error, and for that reason, parent exception is going to occur here. Let's see to handle the exception without maintaining the order of exception. So as I said, if you put the parent exception first, common task completed. So as you can see, it will give you an error. That means you must follow that particular kind of ordering. That means you must keep this particular exception at the end of this order. That means end of this cache order. You cannot put the exception first and then this two exception there, because if you just put this particular exception at first, these two codes are unreachable. So arithmetic exception E and array index out of bound exception are unreachable, because all the errors that are happening in that try block, or all the exception that is going to occur in that particular try block, is going to captured by the single exception class. Clear? Now you can have this kind. Ball, ball. তাহলে তো চলতোই, তাহলে তো কোনো প্রবলেম না, এটা তো আমরা আগেও দেখলাম, এই এক্সাম্পলেই তো আমরা দেখলাম এই। হ্যাঁ তাহলে তো চলতো, এই এক্সাম্পলেই তো আমরা দেখলাম, এই দুটোকে তো আমরা বন্ধ করে দিয়েছিলাম ফার্স্টে, আর এক্সেপশন ক্লাসটাকে রেখেছিলাম। ও এক্সেপশন হচ্ছে ফাদার অফ অল দ্য এক্সেপশন, সো এক্সেপশন ক্লাস ক্যান ক্যাপচার এনি এক্সেপশন। ওকে, এটা তো কোডে প্রবলেম। কম্পাইল টাইম এরর মিন্স এই দুটো তো, এখানে তো অ্যাকচুয়াল মানে অ্যাকচুয়াল মেসেজটা লেখা নেই এখানে। টেস্ট নাও করে দেখি অ্যাকচুয়াল মেসেজটা কি দেখায় সেটা দেখতে হবে তো। কম্পাইল এন্ড রান, এই যে কি দেখাচ্ছে যে জাভা 8 মানে 8 নম্বর লাইন এখানে, arithmetic exception has already been caught and completed। বোঝা গেছে? আর অ্যারে ইন্ডেক্স আউট অফ বাউন্ড তাই, বিকজ অফ দিস এক্সেপশন দিস টু আর ইউজলেস কোড অর আনরিচেবল কোড নাও। সো ওখানে অ্যাকচুয়ালি পুরো মেসেজটা দেখায়নি যে কি এররটা জেনারেট করেছিল। So you can actually go to this site javapoint.com and you can actually run all these codes test now. So you can actually apply your own modifications on all these things. I will highly recommend that. আমার কাছে টাইম ছিল না, না হলে আমি এগুলোকে স্লাইডে অ্যাড করতাম। আমার কাছে টাইম ছিল না, তাই জন্য জাস্ট এখান থেকেই আমাকে দেখাতে হচ্ছে। So nested exception. So we have seen an example where we can actually nest some try-catch blocks. So now let's move into the finally block. So Java finally block is a block that used to execute important code such as closing connection string. So I have mentioned this thing earlier in previous class as well, that this finally block can be used to actually close a file. So regardless whether exception is occurred in that particular file or not, we must close a file before exiting from the program so that the file content can be saved. So in those kind of scenario, this finally block is really helpful. So what it does, it will execute even though there is an error and that is not handled, even though there is an error and that is handled by a try-catch block. So let's look at this flow chart, flow diagram. So what is happening? Program code, exception occurred. If yes, exception handled. If no, then finally block will execute. Exception occurred. No, then finally block will execute. Exception occurred. Yes, exception handled. Yes, then also finally block will execute. So this is a block that is going to execute even though you don't have any exception. You have an exception, you have not handled that exception, you have an exception, you have handled that exception. So in those three scenarios, this particular code or this particular block is going to execute. So this is your finally block. So finally block in Java can be used to put cleanup code such as closing file, closing connection, etc. So as I mentioned earlier. So as you can see, we have here a situation. So we have int data. So in this particular code, no exception will be occur. We have null pointer exception. We have got a null pointer exception that is not even related to both of them. So int data is equal to 25 divided by 5 and sub system.out.println data. So we are printing 5 on the console. So no error will be generated, and finally block is always going to execute. So this particular block is going to execute and the rest of the code is going to execute. So let's see the output. So output is 5, finally block is always executed and rest of the code is going to execute. Now what will happen if there is an exception? So we have an exception, int data 25 divided by 0 system.out.println data. Catch null pointer exception. Because it is an arithmetic exception, we have not actually successfully captured this particular exception. That means the rest of the code is not going to execute. We have already seen this. But what will happen to this finally block? So here it is written finally block is always executed. So as you can see, it is the output is finally block is always executed, and then it is going out of this particular bound. That means it is saying exception in thread main java.line divided by 0. So this particular block is going to execute. If it is handled, so we have got an arithmetic exception. So it is handled first, then finally block is going to execute and the rest of the code is going to execute. So anyone has any question regarding this finally block? So we have seen or we have shown three different scenarios where the finally block is going to execute. Anyone has any question regarding this finally block? So So let's move into this Java throw keyword. So this is another keyword. So Java throw keyword is used to explicitly throw an exception. So what is the syntax? The syntax is this: you have to throw an instance of the class with some custom message. You can actually uh, give some custom message while throwing that particular exception. So we can throw either checked or unchecked expression in Java by throw keyword. So both the type of errors, checked and unchecked, can be thrown. The throw keyword is mainly used to throw custom exception. Uh, we will see custom exceptions later. So also I'm going to show you custom exceptions. I have the code ready here. So I guess we stop here for some break. So we will start from 2, okay, or 2:15. Okay, so we are going to start from 2:15, and we will complete all the other things up to the custom exception class, and hopefully we can actually start this Java file handlings. Okay, so I am positive that we can actually do some file programming today. So yeah, class is being recorded, no problem. কিন্তু এত কম ছেলে পেলে, নো প্রবলেম, নাম্বার পাবে না। আজকে আমি অ্যাটেন্ডেন্স নেব, অ্যান্ড দিস পার্টিকুলার ফাইল উইল বি শেয়ার্ড উইথ অনলি দোজ হু আর হেয়ার। তাদের ইমেল আইডিতেই শেয়ার করব, গুগল ড্রাইভে আপলোড করে। ওকে, তোরা লিভ করে যেতে পারিস ও থাকতে পারিস, নো প্রবলেম, আমি আছি। রেকর্ডিংটা আমি পোস্ট করে দিচ্ছি। So this throw keyword is used to throw some exception. That means you can actually manually catch the exception or manually detect the exception and throw the particular type of exception. And that exception can be caught automatically uh, by the compiler, or you can actually catch using try catch block. So it can be done both ways. So for example of this throw keyword, what we have here, so we have created a class test throw one, where we have some method, or the main method, public static void main string args, where we want to validate 13. What is this validate? This is a method. uh, so this method is going to use to check for an age, or check a age for validation in the sense, so suppose we have, if someone is less than 18 years of age, he or she is not eligible for voting. So this is what meant by this particular code. So we want to generate or we want to send arithmetic exception for this regard. So what we have here, we have a validate method. Now this method is static. Why? Because main is a static member, and we know that static methods can only access another static method of a particular class. So what we have here, uh, we pass that integer value, that is the age, and if the age is less than 18, we throw a new arithmetic exception, and we pass a particular value that is not valid. You can pass something like this: you are not eligible, you are not eligible vote. So whatever custom message you want to pass, so this is our custom message that we have passed in this particular case. And else system.out.println welcome to vote. So if this particular age that has been passed with this validate statement is valid, that means if it is greater than 18 or not less than 18, so the message that is welcome to vote, and the rest of the code will be printed. If it is not like that, so you are not eligible message will be printed, because if you are not a voter in this particular program, suppose uh, you cannot do the further operation. That means you are not elder enough, you cannot do some operation. So in this particular case, if you run this particular code, the output will be arithmetic exception, but this time uh, here we have a custom message that is not valid. This is just throwing an exception depending on certain situation. We have not caught this exception. So this is caught, or this is handled by the compiler itself. That's why the program has stopped working after this particular point. So this is something like throws keywords that we have used with a function. So throw is actually manually throwing an exception. So at that particular time we use throw keyword. So we manually detect that particular error and we have thrown that particular error. So we are going to test it now and explore something more about this. So if you just compile and run, so as you can see, exception at thread main java.lang arithmetic exception not valid. So you can see that it is generated, or it has generated an error in main method. So it has generated an error in main method. So this is our main method where the exception has generated, and we have the flow from which function the error actually originally generated. So it was generated at validate function Java line number 15, and afterwards it was transferred into main at validate 13. So that means as we have called this function here, the error is generated in this particular line, and we have not actually managed or tried to catch that particular error. What we can do that actually, so what we have to do here, we have to put our suspicious code into a try catch block. So you add a try catch block here. So we have added a try catch block here, and now catch. Suppose we don't know what kind of exception is going to caught by this particular statement. So we are just keeping it exception E and try to print whatever value is there in this particular exception. So system dot out dot println E, suppose. So now as you can see, the error message is different because we have handled our code differently. So we have handled the exception that has been generated in this particular code. So now look at this thing. This particular line, this particular function, validate function has generated an exception. Manually, we have created an exception manually with some custom message. And we have captured that exception within another function. So this is possible. From this, you can actually tell that, or you can actually have the idea that these errors or these exceptions can propagate to one function to another function. So it is actually propagating from the child function to the parent function or the calling function. So we have actually captured that particular exception using this particular statement, and that is the proof is not valid. So this not valid was written instead of divisible by 0 or whatever it is. So you can actually catch arithmetic exception here, and you can actually run this code, and the rest of the code is also running this time. So that means we have thrown us we have thrown or we have throw new exception or exception, and we have cached that exception into its calling function. So this is how throw block or throw keyword actually works to throw some exception at the runtime. So this is actually throwing a new instance of arithmetic class. So every time throw actually throws a new instance uh, of any exception. So exception propagation, so that is what I said, that it has a chain propagation like we we have seen in this or on that particular example. Similarly, in this particular scenario, as you can see, a error has been generated in function m, uh, that has been called in function n, and that has been called in function p, and we have rectified our error in this function p, and we have called it here. So this is how you can see that it propagates. So it is propagating from, so the error is generating on p, m, then n, then p, and then it is also propagated on main, but it is handled at p. Another interesting thing is that, so all those unchecked exceptions actually propagate, whereas checked exception cannot propagate. So checks exception cannot propagate. What that does mean, so suppose in this particular aim function, the similar example is there. In this particular aim function, we have thrown a IO exception where we have written device error. This time it will give a compilation time error. That means you actually cannot propagate your function. That means this particular code will give an error. So let's take a look at what is the error. So it is saying, sorry, IO operation is not, oh, sorry. Okay, let's just copy this. Control C, create a notepad. File, save as. Java. Test exception propagate 2. Now just open it. Open file. Test exception propagate 2. So this is our code. Now we are going to compile it. So Java C test custom class C. So as you can see, it is written that unreported exception, IO exception, must be caught or detected through new java.io.io exception device error. So as you can see that this particular exception is actually not carried away or not carry forwarded to its calling function like in our previous example. So like in our previous example, this particular flow is this particular exception is not caught or handled by this exception handler because this is a checked exceptions. So there is different way to actually handle that. What we can do, we can use throws keywords that can actually help in propagating this kind of errors. So the syntax of throws keyword is something like this: return type method throws exception class name, only the class name, and you can actually give multiple type of okay, let's come to that. So what this does, this can actually propagate unchecked exceptions as well. So this can actually propagate unchecked exceptions. So for example, so this is the same code. This is the same code, and what is happening here? We have just added throws IO exception and also throws IO exception here. So this throws IO exception is actually able to propagate the exceptions from this particular line. So what will happen if you execute this particular code? What will happen? It will generate exception handled. So it is that exception is handled by this try catch block, because now the exception can propagate to its calling function. So throws actually returns the exception to its calling function. So what is happening here? The exception is generated here, and using this throws IO, it is when this function is called. So this is generating the exception here, and when that exception is generating here, it is thrown by this IO exception, and the exception is generating here, and this exception is now caught by this exception handler. So using the throws keyword, we can actually catch or propagate checked exceptions throughout the functions. So now this particular code or that particular previous code is running absolutely fine and generating no error, and the normal flow is also being executed. That is, the last line of this particular code is being executed. So normal flow is being executed. So now look at the same scenario. So we have an exception generated here. So throw new IO exception, and we have thrown that particular exception through this method function. So this is another class. Yeah. So this is a main M class, and now we have created an object of class M and called that particular method and handled that particular exception. So what is happening? The exception is handled and normal flow. So a exception generated in different class or a different method of different class is handled by a different method of another class or inside a different method of another class. So this is also possible using throws keyword. So throws keyword is actually returning the exception generated in some function to its calling function. So that's why using the try catch block we can actually manage or handle this kind of exception. And there is another way, that is what we used to do is throwing the exception through the main function. So what we are doing here, so we have thrown IO exception error. Oh, so not sorry. So we have not actually generated or thrown IO exception here. We have not generated anything. So suppose we have done some operation related to IO. We have done some operation related to IO here. And what we are expecting that if no error is occurring in this particular scenario or in this particular code, the code will run without any issue. And if some error is occurring, then it will throw an exception. That means we are not coding an exception. So there are two different ways to throw an exception. Either, so first example was along with the throw keyword, and this time we have a code where we don't expect that 99% of time nothing is going to happen in that particular code. So in those situations we are actually just declaring the class of exception, and we keep everything to the compiler itself. So if some error is occurring in some time or in near future, it will generate an error like we used to do in case of IO exception. So what we write if we have some IO operation here. एक second ना. Hello. বল হয়েছে ও হুম, হুম, লাইন লাইন ডিটেক্টর নাকি? হুম, 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 হুম। উম, বুঝেছি। অনলাইন। হুম, বুঝেছি, ঠিক আছে তাহলে ভালোই। হুম, হুম, ঠিক আছে। টাকা পয়সা নিয়ে নিস, ঠিক আছে। 20,000 টাকাটাও নিয়ে নিস। ঠিক আছে। হুম। So you can use any one of the ways. Either you can handle the exception by your own or just declare the exception, assuming that no error is going to happen, or 99% of the time no error is going to happen, or no exception is going to occur, and the code will run successfully. Like in this particular case, nothing has occurred and it has actually run very efficiently and reached to the normal flow or the last line of the code. Whereas in this particular time or in this particular situation, we have that particular error, and that error is not handled inside this main block. And what we have done, we have just declared the exception. So what is happening? A runtime exception is going to happen. That we have seen in our examples as well. That if we don't handle it, we can just declare it and assume that nothing is going to happen. So these two situations can occur. হুম, হুম। এখানে তো এরর নেই, মানে আমি কি বললাম, আইও এক্সেপশন তো আমরা জেনারেট করতে পারবো না কোনোভাবেই, ঠিক আছে। আইও এক্সেপশন আমরা কোনোভাবেই জেনারেট করতে পারবো না। সো এখানে এই জিনিসটাই দেখানো হয়েছে, যদি এখানে আইও এক্সেপশন না হয় তাহলে প্রোগ্রাম সাকসেসফুলি এক্সিকিউট করছে। কি করে আমরা জেনারেট করতে পারি? উইথ দ্য হেল্প অফ উইথ দ্য হেল্প অফ থ্রো কিওয়ার্ড, রাইট। এইখানে আমরা এক্সেপশনটা জেনারেট করেছি, জেনারেট করার পর এখানে তো হ্যান্ডলিং মেথড নেই, মানে ট্রাই ক্যাচ ইউজ করা হয়নি। ট্রাই ক্যাচ তো আগেরটাতেও ট্রাই ক্যাচ ইউজ করা হয়নি, কিন্তু ওখানে তো এররটাও জেনারেট করেনি। হিয়ার উই ডোন্ট হ্যাভ এনি এরর। আও এক্সেপশনের তো কোনো এররই নেই এখানে, এখানে তো জাস্ট প্রিন্টিং করা হয়েছে একটা। আমরা যদি ইনপুট নিই, আমি কি বললাম, মোস্ট অফ দ্য কেসেসে ইনপুটে কোনো এরর হবে না। ইনপুটে কখন এরর হবে? যখন বাফারটা কোনো কারণে ফলস খেয়ে গেছে, বা যেই ইনপুট ডিভাইস থেকে রিড হচ্ছে সেই ডিভাইসটা ফল্ট করে গেছে, তখন এররটা আসবে। তো নর্মালি কিন্তু ওই আইও এরর হওয়ার কোনো চান্স নেই, বাট একটা প্রিকশন টাইপের থ্রো করে রাখা মানে হচ্ছে একটা প্রিকশন টাইপের। তাহলে দুটো ওয়ে হচ্ছে আমার কাছে, মানে থ্রোস কিওয়ার্ড ইউজ করে দুটো ওয়ে। একটা হচ্ছে তুমি প্রিকশন ইউজ করলে as well as you handle that particular error, like we did in this particular example. লাইক এখানে এরর যদি জেনারেট হয় তবুও এক্সেপশন হ্যান্ডেল করবে, যদি জেনারেট না হয়, এরর যদি না থাকে সাপোজ এই কোডটাতে, তবুও কিন্তু নর্মাল ফ্লোতেই আমার প্রোগ্রাম রান করবে। এইখানে কিন্তু আমি এক্সেপশনটা হ্যান্ডেল করিনি, এখানে কিন্তু এক্সেপশনটা হ্যান্ডেল করেছি। সেটাই বলা হচ্ছে এক্সেপশনটা যখন হ্যান্ডেল করছি না, তখন আমি থ্রোস কিওয়ার্ড ইউজ করছি ইন মেন ফাংশন। এখানে কিন্তু দেখ মেন ফাংশনে থ্রোস কিওয়ার্ডটা নেই। এটা কিন্তু আমার ফার্স্ট এক্সাম্পলটা যখন দেখিয়েছিলাম সেই জায়গাতেই আমি কিন্তু দেখিয়েছিলাম যে প্রথমে আমি আইও এক্সেপশনটা থ্রো করেছিলাম, এইখানে আমি আইও এক্সেপশনটা ফার্স্টে থ্রো করেছিলাম, তাই না? এখানে আমি আইও এক্সেপশনটা ফার্স্টে থ্রো করেছিলাম, কিন্তু থ্রো করার পর তারপরে কি করলাম সেটাকে আমি আবার এখানে কিন্তু ক্যাপচার করে নিয়েছিলাম, করার পর ওখান থেকে আইও এক্সেপশনটাকে তুলে নিয়েছিলাম। দ্যাট মিনস দিস ইজ ম্যানুয়ালি হ্যান্ডেলড বাই মাই সেলফ, অ্যান্ড অন দ্যাট পার্টিকুলার সিচুয়েশন ইট ইজ নট ম্যানুয়ালি হ্যান্ডেলড, অ্যান্ড প্রোগ্রাম কিন্তু ওখানেই টার্মিনেট করে যাবে। সো এটা হচ্ছে যেহেতু 99% অফ দ্য কেসেস আমি ধরে নিচ্ছি, বা 90% অফ দ্য কেসেস আমি ধরে নিচ্ছি যে নো এরর no such kind of exception will be generated. So sometimes you can just declare the error, and leave it as it is. Don't need to handle it. এই জিনিসটা এই দুটো এক্সাম্পলে বলা হয়েছে যে এইখানে আমি এররটা জেনারেট করিনি, মানে এখানে আমার এররটা জেনারেট হয়নি, এই মেথডে আমি এররটা জেনারেট করতে পারিনি কোনোভাবেই, yet the program is running fine, but এখানে যেহেতু আমার এররটা জেনারেট হয়েছে and we have not have any cache block to catch this particular code, we have defined the exception, we have defined the exception inside the main. So what is happening? A runtime error is going to happen. That means it will tell us that IO exception has occurred. Nothing else, and program will stop at that particular time. So it is depending on the criteria of the application whether you want to apply the manual detection as well as manual catch, or you just want to have your code with just declaration statement of the exception. So it depends on the programmer as well as it depends on the application, which type of application you are trying to create. দুটোর উপর বেস করে ডিপেন্ড করছে। ক্লিয়ার? এই তো এখানে তো এক্সেপশনটা জেনারেট করা হয়েছে। আরে এখানে এই আউটপুটে তো অ্যাকচুয়ালি মেসেজটা দেখাচ্ছে না, বললাম তো। এইখানে এটা আবার রান করি যখন করবো, এখানে তো আইও এক্সেপশনে কি এরর দেখায় আমরা তো দেখেছি অলরেডি আগে। কি নাম ছিল? টেস্ট থ্রো 4 জাভা সি টেস্ট, জাভা সি টেস্ট থ্রোজ 4। এই তো ডিভাইস এরর। কম্পাইল টাইম এররটা আসবে না, থ্রো করে দিলে কম্পাইল টাইম এররটা আসবে না, কিন্তু সেটা রান টাইমে গিয়ে জেনারেট হবে। আমি যদি থ্রোজ আইও এক্সেপশন না জেনারেট করতাম দিতাম এখানে, সাপোজ এটা নেই, তাহলে কম্পাইলেশন টাইমেই আমাকে এররটা দিত। কম্পাইলেশন টাইমেই আমাকে এররটা দিয়েছে, মাস্ট বি কট অর ডিক্লেয়ার্ড। আর যখন ডিক্লেয়ার করে দিলাম তখন কম্পাইলেশন টাইমে কিছু হলো না, রান টাইমে এররটা গিয়ে আসলো। রান টাইমে এররটা এসছে, কিন্তু যদি এই লাইনটা না থাকে, সাপোজ দিস পার্টিকুলার লাইন ইজ নট দেয়ার, তাহলে কিন্তু আবার আসবে না। সি নর্মাল ফ্লো, মানে যদি আমার এক্সেপশন জেনারেট হয় দেন রান টাইম এররটা দেবে, আর যদি এক্সেপশন জেনারেট না হয় দেন নর্মাল যেমন ফ্লো হচ্ছে তেমন প্রোগ্রাম ফ্লো হবে। এটাই জাস্ট থ্রো। ঠিক আছে? Okay, so what are the differences between throw and throws? Uh, so Java throw is used to explicitly throw an exception. So that I said, or that we have seen. Java throws keyword is used to declare an exception. Also, it is used to propagate checked exceptions. Checked exceptions cannot be propagated using throw, that we have already seen. Throw is followed by an instance. Throws is followed by a class. Throw is used within a method. Throw is used with the method signature or method declaration or method header. You cannot throw multiple exceptions. You can declare multiple exceptions like public void, method throw, IO exception, SQL exceptions, and so on. Okay, so multiple exceptions can be thrown altogether, but you cannot throw multiple exceptions. So these are the differences between throw and throws. Now we have actually learned finally keyword. We have already learned final keyword as well. So final keyword was on inheritance, where we have a restriction over the inheritance. So finally is used to apply restriction on class. Not only class, we can define final with methods and variables as well. So methods and variables. So final class cannot be inherited. Final method cannot be overridden. And final value cannot be changed. That means final value, that means a constant value. That particular variables, that the value of that particular variable cannot be changed. Whereas finally is used to place important code. It will be executed whether exception is occurred or not. That means exception is handled or not. And finalized, it is another keyword. So finalize, or not, it is not a keyword, it is a function. So finalize is used to perform cleanup processing just before object is garbage collected. So final is a keyword, finally is a block, and finalize is a method. So for now, just forget about finalize. Just remember the difference between final and finally. Now, custom exception or custom exception. So custom exception means we can say that user defined exception. এখান থেকে একটা কোয়েশ্চেন পরীক্ষাতে আছে, user defined exception. So what is it? You can create your own exception depending on certain situation. So if you are creating an own exception that is known as custom exception or user defined exception, Java custom exceptions are used to customize the exception according to your need. So we can actually use the exceptions that are available in library and extending them. That means by inheriting them, we can create our own exception. By the help of custom exception, you can have your own exception and message. That means you can have your own criteria for exception, and you can have your own message, custom message. Criteria in the sense, suppose you want a valid age. The age should be suppose 0, age suppose 80. So for some certain situation, you might need the people or the age that is from 1 to 80 suppose. So at that particular situation, you can create your own custom exception. What you have to do, you have to just extend the exception class. That means you have to inherit the exception class. Let's check out the example that we have already built here. So we have our uh, class here. So this is our main class. So suppose okay. So from here we can actually check. So this is our suppose a class. In that particular class we have a method validate. So you have seen this, right? This validate method. So where we want to validate whether age is less than 18 or not. So this time we have not thrown arithmetic exception because arithmetic exception is not a category for this kind of error. We have used arithmetic exception as an example in that throw keyword. But here what we want a new type of exceptions like invalid age exception. So this is a new type of exception. We have not created this kind of exception yet. Just we want to throw a new kind of exception and where we want to put our message. And also we can throw that using throw invalid age exception. So we have thrown that as well. And if this exception is not generated, that means if it is a valid age, it will print welcome to port. So what we have tried here, we have tried to validate this, that means validate 15, and inside the case block we have written exception message that has been transferred from here. So what we have to do, so we have to create this particular class. We have to create this particular class invalid age exception. For that, in the same file, what you can do, we have created a class invalid age exception. Extend the exception class. So you extending the exception class, you can create your own exception. And what you have to do in that exception class, you just have to create the constructor. Either you can create the default constructor or you can actually create the own constructor. So suppose what we are trying to do, we are trying to just pass this particular message that we have received from this particular function call to the original exception class. So we have transferred everything to the original exception class. That means we have not written anything by ourselves. So we have transferred everything to the exception class. Now if you execute this code, now consider this, the value of this validate or the age is 15. That is not valid. That means it should print not valid. Okay. And we have our rest of the code as well. So we have our rest of the code as well. So this code is going to execute as well. So just executing it. Okay. Java C test custom dot java. So compilation is done. Now to execute it, you just have to mention the class name. That is Java test custom exception. Enter. So as you can see, exception occurred. What is the exception? Exception is invalid age exception. So what exception class does is actually embed the class name within this message. And what is the message? That is not valid. That means not a valid age. Now if you want, you can actually write some exception, or you can write your exception without the super method as well. That means you don't want to pass your values to the exception class. You can just write your own exception or own message as well. So if you just write like this and then compile it and then execute it, so it is saying that exception occurred, invalid age, sorry, not a valid age for vote, invalid age exception. So what we have done, we have actually received a message, but we have not passed that message to exception class. So that particular message was not printed here, or that particular message is missing from here. If you pass this, as well as you write this statement, so the execution will look like this. So as you can see, not a valid age for vote, then invalid age exception, not valid, and rest of the code. So we have added two messages. Now one is from our own exception class, another one is from the exception superclass or the exception class. So this is how you can write your own exception. Just create your own exception depending on some criteria, throw that particular exception. Anyone have any questions? There is a question on exam from this custom exception class. Obviously বাকি exception থেকেও আছে, but এখান থেকেও একটা আছে program. প্রত্যেকটা কোশ্চেনে একটা করে প্রোগ্রাম আছে, একটা করে থিওরি না, তোদের 14 করে তো। ওই তো প্রথমে হচ্ছে 10টার মধ্যে থেকে, না, প্রথমে হচ্ছে 14টাই করতে হবে শর্ট কোশ্চেন। 14টাই করতে হবে শর্ট কোশ্চেন টাইপের, মানে পুরোটাই হচ্ছে ওই আউটপুট বেসড। ঠিক আছে, না ওখানে কোনো অপশন নেই। আর বাকি থাকলো আরো 4টে করতে হবে 7টার মধ্যে থেকে, এই 5টার মধ্যে থেকে, এই না 6টার মধ্যে থেকে, 6টার মধ্যে থেকে 4টে। আর প্রত্যেকটা কোয়েশ্চেনেই একটা করে লেজুর প্রোগ্রাম দেওয়া আছে, 2 3 3 নাম্বার 4 নাম্বার করে এরকম। হ্যাঁ, এই তোদের যাওয়া তো নেই, তোদের হচ্ছে প্র্যাকটিক্যাল শুধু। এখান থেকে আর কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন, এক্সেপশন থেকে আর কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন, এক্সেপশন হচ্ছে শেষ হয়ে গেল। কারো কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন? ওকে আচ্ছা থাক। এই সকালে যতজন ছিল তাদের শুধু মেলেই আমি, কোনটা কোনটা? হ্যাঁ আমি এটা দিয়ে দেবো, কোনো ব্যাপার না। আর 2 4টে জিনিস যেগুলো করাতে হবে তোদেরকে, সেটা হচ্ছে